حي على الفلاح.
And the Ummah agreed, the Muslimin, that Uthman was appointed as Khalifa, and Uthman was the third rightly guided Khalifa of the Muslimin. Before we go into the Khilafah of Uthman and how he ruled and how he was as a Khalifa governing the different provinces and the openings that took place and so forth, we want to get to know Uthman a bit and who he was and the different matters in his life between Mecca and between Medina. Now Uthman radiallahu anhu, as we know, he is from Bani Umayyah, and his full name is Uthman ibn Affan ibn Abi al-As ibn Umayyah ibn Abd Shams ibn Abd Manaf ibn Qusay ibn Kilab. And his lineage meets with the lineage of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Abd Manaf. And he is from the original tribes of Quraysh. And not only does his lineage meet with that of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Abd Manaf, his grandmother was the full sister of Abdullah, the father of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he was the cousin of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that was a great aspect for Uthman radiallahu anhu, not being only close to him by the ties of Islam, but also being close to him by the ties of lineage. His kunya during the Jahiliyyah was Abu Amr. When he got married to the daughter of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to Ruqayyah radiallahu anha, and she had his first child, his kunya became Abu Abdullah. And then we have what is called a laqab, or a nickname, and this is usually given by the people to the person. Now Uthman ibn Affan is known by one very famous laqab, was Dhun Nurayn, the one of the two lights, was because he was married to two daughters of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Not at the same time. He was first married to Ruqayyah, and then Ruqayyah radiallahu anha, she died in the first years of Medina, and then after that the Prophet ﷺ married him to his other daughter Kulthum. And the ulama, they mention that there is no previous man who ever got married to two daughters of a prophet or a messenger, except Uthman radiallahu anhu. Another narration that mentions why he was called the Nurayn is because he used to recite the Quran during the day and during the night. And this is a nur from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He was born 6 years after the incident of the elephant. And Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam was born when? The year of the elephant. Uthman was born 6 years after that. So he's about 5 or 6 years younger than the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So he was close in age to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Az-Zuhri, he said Uthman was a man of average height with handsome hair and face and a bald spot. He was bow-legged and with a hooked nose, big calves and long arms that were covered with hair. He had the most handsome mouth of all the people, his speech yani. Soft-skinned with a huge thick beard and thick hair on his head, and he used to dye his beard with a za'faran or saffron. And that's why he was known to be one of the handsome Sahaba, one of the good-looking Sahaba radiyallahu anhu. Before his entering into Islam, Uthman radiyallahu anhu was from amongst the best of people of Quraysh, and he was known for his wealth, his modesty, and his eloquent in speech. He was a man of honor, he was a man of modesty, and he was a man who preserved himself. And Uthman radiallahu anhu, as he mentions himself, he says, never in my life did I prostrate to an idol. Never in my life did I commit zina. This is during the time of Jahiliyyah, no Islam, no nothing. But a man of honor, a man who preserves himself, says, I never committed zina. I never drank alcohol. And he comes from a wealthy family. And Uthman radiallahu anhu, during Jahiliyyah, and before Islam and after Islam and until he died radiallahu anhu, he was a tradesman. He was a businessman. He used to trade. He used to send camels back and forth. He had his own trade link between Mecca before and then Medina and the different lands around him. And he was known for his wealth. And he had inherited his wealth and the business from his father. And he continued in the business of his father, and he became successful in that business. So during Jahiliyyah, he was an honorable man, known to Quraysh, respected amongst his people. And a person like that, with the coming of Islam, the person is only going to improve, because Islam adds on to those virtues and perfects it. The prophecy of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam was sent down by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Muhammad ibn Abdullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam was chosen as the prophet and messenger, the man from Quraysh, to be the last and the seal of prophets and messengers. And Uthman radiallahu anhu at that time was the age of 34. And as we know, the first human being to accept Islam was his wife Khadija. The first man to accept Islam was Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. The first youth to accept Islam was Ali ibn Abi Talib. And Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu, from the many virtues that he has in his status, is that he was the da'i of Islam in its early stages. And Abu Bakr entering into this religion, he began his da'wah. And from the first people that he called to Islam was Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu. And it wasn't something that needed months of speaking of da'wah, no. One talk from Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu opened the heart of Uthman. Then Uthman with Talha went to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam spoke to them about Islam and logic, and the person who really wants the best for themselves, they accepted Islam there and then. And they were from the first people to enter into Islam and follow the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam from the first days of Islam, with the birth of Islam. And Uthman radiallahu anhu took Islam and accepted the religion of Islam, and then never looked back. When Uthman became a Muslim, the Muslimin around him, that small number of believers, rejoiced with the Islam of Uthman. Uthman radiallahu anhu, like the Sahaba, was persecuted by the people of Mecca, and he was persecuted by his own uncle, whom had tied him up and being left there unless you leave Islam. He said to his nephew, he says, I am not going to let you go until you leave the deen of Muhammad and you go back to the deen, the religion of your forefathers. Uthman radiallahu anhu says, do what you want to do, for I will never leave the religion of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. I will never leave the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, before his prophecy, he had married two of his daughters to two sons of Abu Lahab, Ruqayyah and Kulthum. But that marriage was not yet consummated, meaning that his daughters were still at his house with him. Two sons of Abu Lahab, Utbah and Utaybah. Now Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, during his call to Islam, one of the main ones who opposed him was Abu Lahab. Hakim, his wife, was also one of the enemies of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam and one of the enemies of Islam. Abu Lahab and his wife Hakim ordered their sons to divorce the daughters of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam and let them stay at home with their father, and they won't get anyone better to get married to. When the divorce took place and the sons of Abu Lahab divorced the daughters of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he proposed and offered of his daughter Ruqayyah to Uthman ibn Affan. He never got married before Ruqayyah radiallahu anha. And this was from the most joyful moments of Uthman radiallahu anhu. What a position, what an honor, and what a moment. So Khadija radiallahu anha prepared her daughter for Uthman radiallahu anhu, like the people they do today, in which they prepare their daughters and so forth for marriage. And it was said after they got married that they were the best looking couple anyone has ever seen, Uthman ibn Affan and Ruqayyah radiallahu anhuma. And then he said to his daughter, the Prophet ﷺ entered upon his daughter when she was washing the head of Uthman, and he said, Ya bunayya, be dutiful, take care of Abu Abdullah, for verily he is the closest of my companions to me in his manners, in his etiquettes, in his attitude. Take care of him. Throughout his life got married 8 times. First got married to the daughter of the Prophet ﷺ, Ruqayyah. Then after she passed away, got married to her sister Kulthum. And then Kulthum passed away also before the death of the Prophet ﷺ. And then he got married after that throughout his life. And he lived a long life to his 80s. And had many children, many boys and many girls. His first son was Abdullah, the son or the grandson of the Prophet ﷺ, the son of Ruqayyah radiyallahu anha. But his son from Ruqayyah passed away at a young age. And the Prophet ﷺ was very saddened by the death of his grandchild Abdullah. And Uthman radiyallahu anhu, he never lived outside of Medina. He stayed in Medina, stayed close to the Prophet ﷺ, and then even after his death remained close to Abu Bakr. After Abu Bakr's death he remained close to Umar, and then as Khalifa he remained in Medina, so he didn't leave Medina. And Medina at that time was that protected capital of the Muslimin. And as we mentioned in the time of Umar radiallahu anhu, he made sure that the major Sahaba stayed in Medina, stayed close to him in Medina, unless there was a necessity to send them out. Why? To keep that environment in Medina and to keep those Sahaba close to the Khalifa. Because as we've mentioned many times, the Khalifa is as strong as his council and the people who are around him. There was 2 migrations that took place before the migration to Medina. Migrated to Abyssinia, to Al-Habasha. The first migration took place, and then the second migration took place. Uthman and his wife Ruqayyah radiyallahu anhuma, they both took those migrations and migrated to Al-Habasha. Even though they were short-lived and not for long, but it shows you to what extent in which the trials and tribulations and the hardship that they were going to, that they had to leave their own land. Uthman and the Holy Quran, it is known that Uthman radiyallahu anhu lived a life attached and took as a companion the Quran. And he narrates himself the way in which they used to learn the Quran. He says that me and the Sahaba like Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and so forth, we used to learn 10 verses. And then we wouldn't move forward and learn more verses until we have memorized, understood and implemented those 10 verses. And that's why Uthman radiallahu anhu was one of the ones who was known as a memorizer of the Quran. And he had recited the Quran to the Prophet ﷺ, the complete Quran, before his death sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So he lived a life in which he took the Quran as a companion. And he took the Quran, and the Quran guided him through his life. During the time in Medina, he remained close to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, learning of him, taking in that experience as being the companion of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He took part in the different expeditions. He was given the bay'ah by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself in the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, when Uthman was sent in to Mecca to negotiate, and then the rumor came out, and then the bay'ah was given, and Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he took his hand in his own hand and he said, "Hadihi an Uthman." This is the bay'ah from Uthman, and he made sure that the Sahaba, they saw it. Uthman, when he entered into Mecca and negotiated with them, they told him, go and circulate the Kaaba. Go and do tawaf. Isn't that what you're here for? He said, by Allah, I will never do tawaf until the Prophet ﷺ does tawaf. And he continued in funding. He didn't just pack his stuff up, neglect his work, give up his work, and then go and stick with the Prophet ﷺ. No, if anything, his business became more prosperous after his Islam. Why? Because he used his business as a means of pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the difference with Uthman and many people is that Uthman radiallahu anhu never allowed his wealth to change him. Never allowed his wealth to turn him away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And a lot of the virtues of Uthman came behind using his wealth to spend in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and there's many virtues that come with that. He was the one who bought Bi'r Rawma in Medina when the Prophet ﷺ came to Medina, and there was no fresh water to drink from except a well. And that well, some narrations it mentions, was owned by a Jewish man, and he would only allow the people to take water from it by paying money. So Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, who will buy the well of Rawma? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with every drink of water, He will place it for him in Jannah. So Uthman radiallahu went and he bought that well, and he placed it as a waqf lillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He placed it as a general possession of the ummah. When the masjid needed expanding, the Muslimin grew, the number grew. He said, who will buy the land next to the masjid? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will replace him for it in Jannah. Uthman radiallahu anhu, he put his hand up. He bought the land next to the masjid, and he did the first extension to the Masjid al-Nabawi in Medina. And his contributions continued and continued until after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, until during the time of Umar, during the time of Abu Bakr, during his own Khilafah. Uthman radiallahu anhu, his greatest characteristic, his shyness, his haya. One occasion, he was sitting with his wife Aisha before the verses of hijab were revealed, and Abu Bakr had entered, then Umar entered, and then when Uthman wanted to enter, he told Aisha to get up and to move, and then he sat up. Then when Uthman came in and he finished what he was doing with the Prophet ﷺ, he left. He said, Aisha asked the Prophet ﷺ, why did you do that? He said, Uthman is a very shy man. If he entered and he saw you here and he saw the way I was sitting, his shyness would have not allowed him to speak what he wanted to speak. The other hadith is when Nabi ﷺ was sitting and then Abu Bakr had entered, and the hadith mentions his thigh or his shin. Doesn't only mention his thigh. And a lot of the narrators, a lot of the ulama, they say that the correct narration is his shin, not his thigh. So Abu Bakr entered and he remained as he was. And then Umar entered, he remained as he was. And then Uthman was entering and he covered himself. And then Aisha radiallahu anha, she asked the Prophet ﷺ, why did you not do that for Abu Bakr? He says, how can't I have shyness from a man that the angels themselves are shy from Uthman? And we'll start speaking in the weeks to come of how he ran the Khilafah, how he continued the prosperous path of Umar radiallahu anhu, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed this ummah with someone like Uthman to be its leader radiallahu anhu. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be pleased with him. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.